What if I told you some of the most fearless horror films of the 80s were not flops but were quietly shoved into the dark because studios panicked? Movies too intense, too strange, too confrontational to market. Tonight we dig up the films the industry hoped you would never find. Number 10. The Prowler, 1981. This one was never meant to survive past opening weekend. The Prowler hit theaters with brutal confidence and immediately scared its own distributors. At a time when slashers were supposed to be fast, cheap, and disposable, this film showed up with military precision and effects so realistic that studio executives reportedly worried about backlash. Instead of leaning into its strengths, they quietly let it fade. Set around a small town haunted by a decades-old betrayal, the film moves with the patience of a stalking predator. What separates it from the pack is not the mystery, but the craftsmanship. Tom Savini's effects were not flashy. They were cold, heavy, and uncomfortably convincing. Audiences were not ready for that level of realism, and critics at the time dismissed it as excessive. That reaction sealed its fate. Financially, it barely registered. No major push, no second chance. Video store copies were scarce and often hidden behind more famous titles. Yet horror fans who stumbled across it in the VHS era talked about it like a forbidden tape. Directors later cited it as a turning point where slasher effects stopped being cartoonish and started feeling dangerous. Studios did not bury it because it failed. They buried it because it worked too well. It reminded viewers that violence could feel real, and that made executives nervous. Number 9. The Beyond, 1981. The Beyond is what happens when a studio has no idea what it is selling. Released with butchered edits, confused marketing, and almost no protection from critics, this film was written off as nonsense on arrival. That dismissal followed it for years, which is ironic because confusion is exactly the point. Lucio Fulci did not care about tidy explanations. This film moves like a nightmare that refuses to explain itself. Time slips, logic dissolves, characters walk forward even when every signal tells them not to. American distributors panicked. They trimmed scenes, rearranged moments, and still could not make it behave like a normal movie. Audiences were split. Some walked out, others were hypnotized. Critics called it incoherent. Fans later called it visionary. On home video, it became a whispered recommendation. Not because it was easy, because it felt forbidden. Financially, it limped. Culturally, it grew. Directors from the next generation openly admitted that its dream logic influenced how they approached horror. The studio never embraced that legacy. For years, they treated it like an embarrassment. The Beyond was buried because it refused to explain itself, and in horror, that kind of confidence is terrifying to the wrong people. Number 8. Possession, 1981. This is the one studios truly did not know how to handle. Possession is not loud, it does not explain itself, and it does not care if you are comfortable. Released at the height of safer supernatural trends, this film detonated like a foreign object. Set against a divided Berlin, the story uses horror as emotional warfare. Performances are extreme. Emotions are raw. Isabelle Adjani delivered a performance so intense that it terrified producers more than audiences. The studio expected backlash. They got silence instead. Minimal screens, minimal promotion, then disappearance. Critics at the time had no language for it. Was it horror? Was it art? Was it madness? The confusion stalled it. Financially, it struggled. But on the underground circuit, it exploded. Filmmakers passed it around like contraband. Actors cited it as proof that horror could be dangerous and prestigious at the same time. Years later, it was reclaimed as a masterpiece. Restored, reframed, celebrated. But make no mistake, for years it was hidden on purpose. Not because it failed, because it went too far emotionally and studios had no control over it. Possession was buried because it refused to behave. Number 7. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986. This film scared distributors more than it scared audiences. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer was finished years before most people ever saw it. Not because it was bad, but because nobody wanted their name attached to it. Studios saw it and immediately froze. There was no safety net here, no moral lecture, no reassuring distance between the viewer and what was happening on screen. What made Henry radioactive was its tone. The violence was quiet, casual, treated like routine. Michael Rooker played the lead with such unsettling calm that executives worried the film would be accused of glorifying real-world brutality. So instead of shaping a release strategy, they stalled. The movie sat unseen while lawyers and marketers argued over liability rather than art. Critics who eventually saw it were divided but shaken. Some called it irresponsible. Others called it one of the most honest horror films ever made. Audiences were stunned by its infamous home invasion scene, shot from the perspective of a videotape within the story. That moment alone felt like a line most films were not brave enough to cross in the 80s. Financially, it barely existed during its initial window. No wide release, no mainstream push. But word spread anyway. Horror fans treated it like a cursed object. Directors later admitted it influenced how realism could be used as terror without monsters or gimmicks. The studio did not bury Henry because it lacked quality. They buried it because it removed the comforting lie that horror is fantasy. This film suggested it could be mundane, and that idea terrified the people responsible for selling tickets. Number 6. The New York Ripper, 1982. This is the film that crossed too many lines too fast. The New York Ripper arrived when slashers were profitable but expected to follow a formula. What it delivered instead was abrasive, nihilistic, and openly contemptuous of audience comfort. Studios quickly realized they had something they could not defend. Lucio Fulci pushed brutality into ugly territory. The killer was not mysterious or stylish. He was obscene, taunting, cruel in a way that felt personal rather than theatrical. Early screenings reportedly caused walkouts. Censors circled it immediately. Cuts were demanded. Releases were delayed or outright denied in several regions. American distributors panicked. They stripped advertising, reduced screens, let it die quietly. Critics were merciless at the time, accusing it of being mean-spirited without purpose. That reputation stuck for years, effectively burying the film under its own controversy. But something strange happened on home video. Horror fans re-examined it. They noticed the craftsmanship, the grim urban atmosphere, the way it captured a decaying city that felt genuinely unsafe. It was not fun, it was confrontational, and that was exactly why it endured. Financially, it never recovered from its initial suppression, but culturally it became a benchmark for how far the slasher genre could be pushed before institutions stepped in. Modern filmmakers reference it cautiously, aware of its legacy. The New York Ripper was buried because it refused to be entertaining in a polite way. It dared viewers to look at ugliness without relief. Studios chose silence instead. Number 5. Angst, 1983. Angst was not buried quietly. It was buried decisively. After its release, it was pulled from circulation in multiple countries and treated like a cinematic mistake, not because it failed technically, but because it succeeded emotionally in ways people found unbearable. This film traps you inside the mind of its central character with ruthless precision. The camera stalks. The narration intrudes. There is no distance. Viewers are not observers. They are passengers. That perspective horrified censors and distributors alike. They feared the film placed audiences too close to something they should never experience. Initial reactions were extreme. Some praised its technical innovation. Others condemned it outright. The backlash was swift. Theatrical runs were cut short. Distribution deals evaporated. For years, it was almost impossible to see legally. Financially, it collapsed due to suppression, not lack of interest. Underground copies circulated among filmmakers and critics who spoke of it in hushed tones. Directors later admitted they studied its camera work obsessively. Its influence quietly seeped into modern psychological horror. Studios never revisited it during the 80s. It was easier to pretend it did not exist than to defend it. Only decades later was it restored and reframed as a landmark work. Angst was buried because it proved horror could invade the viewer's mind without spectacle. And once that door was opened, studios realized they could not close it again. Number 4. The Serpent and the Rainbow, 1988. This was supposed to be a prestige horror hit. Instead, it became a problem nobody at the studio wanted to talk about. Directed by Wes Craven after his mainstream success, The Serpent and the Rainbow was darker, stranger, and far more political than the studio expected. When early cuts screened, executives reportedly realized this was not a crowd-pleasing shock ride. It was confrontational, and it made people uncomfortable in ways that were hard to market. The film dives into folklore, science, and power dynamics, presenting horror not as fantasy, but as something rooted in belief systems and control. That terrified marketers. Test audiences were split. Some were mesmerized, others were unsettled without knowing why. The studio reacted by softening the push, trimming the campaign, and quietly letting it slide out of public conversation. Critics at the time did not know what to do with it. Some praised its ambition, others accused it of being too intense and uneven. What went largely ignored was how daring it was for a major studio release in the late 80s. Financially, it underperformed compared to expectations, which only reinforced the decision to move on quickly. Years later, filmmakers began citing it as one of Craven's most fearless works. Its imagery lingered. Its themes aged disturbingly well. Horror fans rediscovered it on late-night television and worn VHS copies, often surprised that a film this serious had been allowed to exist at all. The studio did not bury this film because it failed. They buried it because it challenged the idea that horror should be escapist. It suggested fear could be cultural and psychological. That kind of horror is hard to sell popcorn with. Number 3. Dead Ringers, 1988. Dead Ringers made executives deeply uneasy, not because it was graphic, not because it was shocking in obvious ways, but because it was cold, precise, and relentlessly intimate. David Cronenberg delivered a film that refused spectacle and instead focused on obsession, identity, and decay. That made it nearly impossible to package. Early reactions were baffled. How do you sell a film that feels like a slow, emotional dissection? The studio tried positioning it as a thriller, then quietly stepped back when audiences responded with discomfort rather than excitement. Advertising was minimal. The release was restrained. It was allowed to pass through theaters like a ghost. Critics were divided but intrigued. Some called it brilliant, others called it alienating. Audiences were smaller than expected. Financially, it struggled to justify itself. That sealed its fate. The studio moved on without looking back. Yet among filmmakers and serious horror fans, its reputation grew steadily. Performances were studied, themes were debated. The film became a reference point for how horror could exist without monsters or jump scares. It did not scare you loudly. It unsettled you slowly. For years, Dead Ringers lived in the shadows of Cronenberg's more famous work. It was rarely promoted, rarely celebrated, treated as an odd detour rather than a central statement. The studio buried it because it demanded patience and emotional engagement. In an era chasing big reactions, this film whispered instead. And whispers are easy to ignore until they are impossible to forget. Number 2. The Vanishing, 1988. This is one of the most quietly terrifying films of the decade, and studios knew it immediately. The Vanishing terrified audiences without tricks, without gore, and without relief. That scared distributors. It offered no comfort, no heroic triumph, just an unflinching look at obsession and inevitability. When American studios considered wider promotion, hesitation set in. This was not a film that sent people out smiling. Test viewers were shaken, some were angry. Executives worried about word of mouth not because it was bad, but because it was too effective. So they limited exposure and let it fade. Critics who saw it were deeply impressed, calling it one of the most disturbing experiences they had encountered. But praise did not translate into studio confidence. Financially, it was modest. Culturally, it was explosive. Horror fans spoke about its ending like a shared trauma. Years later, when a remake softened the edges, audiences finally understood what had been lost. The original had no interest in kindness. It respected the viewer enough to let fear land without cushioning. The Vanishing was buried because it proved horror does not need spectacle. It needs conviction. And conviction without compromise makes executives very nervous. Number 1. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. This is the film studios did not just bury. They tried to erase it. Cannibal Holocaust arrived like a legal and moral nightmare wrapped in celluloid. From the moment it screened, distributors panicked. Rumors spread that what audiences were seeing might not be staged. That confusion alone was enough to trigger investigations, bans, and a full retreat by anyone with money on the line. What made the film radioactive was not just its content, but its form. It presented itself as recovered footage years before that technique became mainstream. Viewers were not told where fiction ended. The realism was deliberate and ruthless. Audiences were shaken, critics were outraged, authorities demanded answers. At one point, the director had to prove his performers were alive because people genuinely believed otherwise. Studios immediately distanced themselves, marketing vanished, releases were canceled or blocked outright. Financially, it became a disaster on paper. No respectable company wanted to touch it. The safest move was silence, pretend it never existed, but underground interest exploded. Horror fans sought it out precisely because it was forbidden. Filmmakers studied it obsessively. Whether they loved or hated it, they could not ignore it. It forced conversations about ethics, realism, and responsibility that horror had never faced so directly before. Decades later, its influence is undeniable. Entire genres trace their DNA back to its structure, yet major studios still rarely acknowledge it, not in retrospectives, not in celebrations. It is kept at arm's length like an unresolved crime scene. Cannibal Holocaust was buried because it crossed a boundary the industry was not prepared to defend. It proved cinema could feel too real. And once that illusion was shattered, no studio wanted to admit they had helped unleash it. Now it's your turn. Which of these buried horror films deserves redemption and which should have stayed hidden forever? Are studios protecting audiences or protecting themselves? Drop your take in the comments and let's argue about where horror should draw the line.